The morning they told Sergeant Voss to pack her gear and report to Range 7, nobody explained why. That was the first sign something was wrong. Range 7 sat at the far edge of Fort Bragg's training grounds, past the administrative buildings and the motor pool and the long stretch of asphalt where recruits ran in the dark before dawn. It wasn't a prestige assignment. It was where they sent people they hadn't figured out what to do with yet. Voss knew this. She'd been in the Army long enough to read the geography of a base the way other people read faces. She was 29 years old. She had grown up in Billings, Montana, in a house where the winter came early and stayed, where her father kept a .308 Winchester in the mudroom and treated it with the same quiet respect he gave to everything he considered essential. He was not a dramatic man. He taught her to shoot the way he taught her to drive, patiently, without praise, correcting her grip and her breathing until the correction became unnecessary. By the time she was 17, she was better than he was, and he said so once, plainly, and never mentioned it again. She'd enlisted at 21. Not out of ideology, not out of a recruiter's pitch. She'd enlisted because she was good at something that mattered, and she wanted to be somewhere that acknowledged it. The Army had done that in its way, for a while. Then she'd been assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment's support battalion, and things had gotten more complicated. Staff Sergeant Orrin Hartley was the kind of man who filled a room without meaning to. Not because he was loud, he wasn't, but because he moved through space as though it had been arranged for him. He was 43, a 20-year veteran, and he had built his reputation on a specific philosophy, that standards existed because human beings, left to their own preferences, would always choose comfort over capability. He was not wrong about this. The problem was what he decided to do with the insight. When Voss reported to Range 7 that Monday morning, Hartley was already there, standing at the firing line with his hands behind his back, watching the downrange markers shiver in the wind. He didn't turn when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. "Voss," he said. "Staff Sergeant?" "You know why you're here?" "No, Staff Sergeant." He turned then. He had a way of looking at people that didn't quite land on them, that seemed instead to pass through them, measuring whatever was on the other side. "Because your marksmanship scores came back and I don't believe them." Voss said nothing. She had learned, in the years since basic, that silence was usually the correct response to a sentence that ended with something you weren't expecting. 17 out of 20 at 800 yards, Hartley said. "Wind variable, shifting 14 to 18 knots. You want to explain that to me?" "I shot what I shot, Staff Sergeant. I know what the paper says." He walked toward her slowly, stopping 3 feet away. "I'm asking you to explain it to me. Because what you're telling me is that you outperformed every male shooter in this battalion on that qualification. Every one of them. Some of whom have been doing this for 6, 7, 8 years. He paused. "So, I want to understand what happened." The thing Voss noticed, and would think about later, in the specific way you think about things you understand only after they're over, was that he hadn't accused her of anything directly. He'd framed it as curiosity. As a request for clarification, it was a technique, and it was effective, because it placed the burden on her to explain a performance that needed no explanation, as though the result itself were the irregularity, rather than his discomfort with it. "I've been shooting since I was 9 years old," she said. "A lot of people have been shooting since they were 9 years old." "Yes, Staff Sergeant," he studied her for a moment longer. "You'll re-qualify on Friday. Different range, different conditions. I'll be observing." "Understood." He walked back to the firing line. She stood there for a moment, watching the back of his uniform, and then she walked back toward the motor pool the way she'd come, across the gravel and the asphalt and the long cold morning, and she didn't let herself feel what she was feeling until she was inside and the door was closed. She had been through this before, in smaller ways. The looks during qualification, the extra scrutiny on gear checks, the way a room sometimes recalibrated when she walked into it, that particular stillness that meant people were deciding how to be. She had developed a relationship with these moments that was neither acceptance nor resentment. It was more like recognition, the way you recognize weather. But this was different. Hartley wasn't giving her a look or a silence. He was giving her a process, a formal mechanism for doubt, and that was harder to navigate because it dressed itself in the language of standards. Her bunkmate, Corporal Ines Pacheco, found her cleaning her rifle that evening and said nothing for a long time. Pacheco was from Tucson and had a practical, unadorned approach to most things that Voss had come to rely on. "Heard about Friday," Pacheco said finally. Word travels. It always does. Pacheco sat down on her bunk, unlacing her boots. You going to be okay? I'm going to shoot the same way I always shoot. Pacheco looked at her. That's not what I asked. Voss set the cleaning rod down. She thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. Yeah, she said. I'm going to be okay. What she didn't say, because she didn't have words for it yet, was that she'd spent 8 years in the army learning to be precise, not just with a rifle, but with everything. With her reports, with her language, with the way she occupied space. She had been precise because she had understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that the margin for error available to her was narrower than it was for the people around her, that every mistake would mean twice what it would mean for someone else. She had not resented this, she had simply worked within it, but there was a specific kind of exhaustion that came from performing competence for an audience that had already decided on incompetence. And by Thursday night, she was feeling it in a way she hadn't in a long time. She ate dinner alone. She went over her fundamentals, not because she needed to, but because the repetition was steadying. Breathing, trigger control, natural point of aim, the rifle as an extension, not a tool. Her father's voice underneath all of it, patient and unadorned. You're rushing it. Stop rushing it. She was not rushing it. Friday came cold and overcast, which was fine. She preferred it. Direct sun created mirage, and mirage made the air between shooter and target deceptive in ways that required constant adjustment. Overcast meant more consistent conditions. She noted this and filed it away. Range 7 had been reconfigured. The standard qualification targets were gone. In their place, at distances Voss estimated at between 600 and 1,000 yards, were steel plates set at irregular intervals, some partially obscured by brush, some positioned at angles that required compensation for oblique impact. This was not a standard qualification format. Hartley was there with 2 other staff NCOs, whose names she knew, Breckinridge and Farrow. Both had the same expression, the careful neutrality of men, watching something they expected to confirm a prior conclusion. There was also, to Voss's left at the firing line, a man she didn't recognize, mid-30s, compact, with the kind of stillness that suggested he'd spent significant time in positions where movement had consequences. He introduced himself as Sergeant First Class Raymond Dix, from the battalion's designated marksman program. You're here to observe, she asked. I'm here to shoot the same course you're shooting. He said it without emphasis, neither friendly nor unfriendly. Hartley's idea. She understood immediately what Hartley was doing. He was giving the qualification a benchmark, a direct comparison. If she performed similarly to Dix, who had an established record and no question attached to his results, then her scores could be dismissed as within normal variance. Luck, favorable wind, whatever explanation he'd already settled on. If she outperformed Dix, she would have to do so visibly, undeniably, under conditions he designed. It was in a way almost elegant. It was also the kind of thing that could break a person who let it get inside them. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd never once asked her to prove she was good enough. Not because he hadn't cared, but because the question had never interested him. What she could do was what she could do. The rest was other people's business. She settled into position. The first target was at 640 yards, partially screened by a low stand of brush that put the plate about 1/3 obscured from her angle. She read the wind. It was coming from the northwest at roughly 12 knots, light but consistent. She adjusted, she breathed, she fired. The steel rang at 640 yards, like a very small, very clear bell. She did not look at Hartley. She moved to the next position. The course ran 11 targets over the span of about 40 minutes. Some required repositioning. Some required holdover calculations she made in real time, without a spotter, which was not standard procedure but which Hartley had apparently decided was the format for the day. Dix, to his left, was working with a spotter, a detail Voss noted and set aside. She hit 10 of 11. The one she missed was at 980 yards, partially obscured by a vehicle, placed at an angle she couldn't fully see around, wind shifting in the last 3 seconds before she fired. She pulled the shot fractionally left. The plate didn't ring. She marked it in her head, not with frustration, with information. When the course was complete, they went back to the line. Dix had hit 9 of 11. He had the advantage of a spotter and had still hit 9. Voss had hit 10 without one. Hartley stood at the scoring table for a long moment. Breckinridge said something quietly to Farrow that Voss didn't hear. Farrow looked at his clipboard, and then at the targets, and then at his clipboard again. Hartley turned to her. He had the expression of a man who had asked a question expecting one answer and received another, and was in the process of determining what that meant for the question. "Voss," he said. "Staff Sergeant." A pause. The wind moved through the brush at the edge of the range. "You missed plate 9? "I did." Wind shifted. It did. He looked at her for a longer moment than was strictly necessary. She met his gaze and held it, not with defiance. Defiance would have been the wrong register entirely, but with the same quality of calm she brought to the firing position. Unhurried. Present. "You didn't have a spotter," he said finally. "No, Staff Sergeant." Another pause. Dix, at the edge of her peripheral vision, was doing something with his rifle that required his full attention and apparently precluded any involvement in this conversation, which she suspected was a form of professional courtesy. "I want to understand," Hartley said, and his voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but different, with something working in it that hadn't been there before. "When did you start shooting at these distances?" "I've been shooting at distance since I was a teenager," she said. "My father taught me. We used to spend weekends on a property outside Billings, 600, 700 yards, wind coming off the Rockies." Hartley absorbed this. "Your father a marksman?" "He was a patient man," she said, which might be a better qualification. Something moved across Hartley's face then, too brief to name, but there. He looked down at the clipboard in Breckenridge's hands and then back out at the range, at the steel plates sitting in the cold morning light, waiting. What happened next took about 2 weeks, which is how long institutional acknowledgement typically takes when it's reluctant. She was reassigned, not punitively. The paperwork described it as a lateral move, a recognition of specialized skills, a fit with an emerging program need. She was attached to a newly formed long-range engagement team, operating under a training framework developed in coordination with the 1st Special Forces Command. The team consisted of 5 shooters. She was the only woman. The men on the team, Corporal Estes, Warrant Officer Quinlan, and 2 staff sergeants named Darrow and Breck, received this information with varying degrees of visible reaction. Estes, who was young and from Kentucky and appeared to have strong opinions about breakfast, said nothing, but nodded in a way that suggested he was still deciding. Quinlan, who had 11 years in and the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned what was worth spending energy on, extended his hand and said, "Welcome to the team." Darrow looked at his notes. Breck looked out the window. By the end of the first week, the arrangements had settled into something functional. Not warm, functional, which was fine. She wasn't there to be warm. She was there to shoot. The team's training program included a qualification that the unit called the final mile, not because of its actual distance, which varied, but because of what it was designed to test, whether you could maintain precision when everything else had already been spent. It came at the end of a 3-day field exercise that included sleep deprivation, simulated conditions, land navigation under time pressure, and sustained physical output. By the time you reached the final mile, your hands were tired and your eyes were tired, and the part of your brain that made small corrections was working against a background of noise that wasn't there on a normal range day. The qualification required 3 confirmed hits out of 5 at distances between 800 and 1,200 yards, with engagement windows of 30 seconds per target. Voss had qualified on similar programs before, though not this specific format. She spent the week before the field exercise going over her fundamentals, with the focused attention of someone who trusted process over outcome. Breathing, natural point of aim, trigger break, the rifle as extension. Her father's voice underneath all of it, patient, saying nothing dramatic. The field exercise began on a Tuesday. By Thursday evening, she was operating on 4 hours of sleep across 3 days. Her pack had covered 42 miles of uneven terrain, and she had a blister on her right heel that she had treated twice and decided to stop thinking about. Estes was gray around the eyes. Quinlan moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man running on infrastructure rather than fuel. Darrow had gone quiet in a way that suggested he was conserving resources. Breck had developed a cough. She was tired in a way that wasn't dramatic, just complete. The kind of tired that settled into the body like weather, even in total. The final mile began at 05:30 on Friday, before full light. She took her position. The targets were steel. At ranges, the range officer marked as 840, 960, and 1,120 yards. Only 3, not 5, and with variable wind that was moving in from the west at roughly 15 to 18 knots and shifting. The engagement windows were 30 seconds each. 30 seconds is enough time. It is also not much time when everything else has been spent, she breathed. The first target was the 840. The wind was moving left to right at the moment she settled, gusting at the top of the cycle. She waited. The gusts subsided. A 3-second window of relative consistency. She fired. The steel rang in the dark. The second target. The wind now shifting slightly, angling more from the northwest. She read it. She adjusted. The crosshairs settled. She breathed out halfway and held it, and the trigger broke cleanly. The second plate rang. She heard Quinlan, to her left, fire twice and achieve one confirmed hit on a different course of fire running parallel to hers. Estes, farther left, was still in his first engagement window, working it carefully. The third target, 1,120 yards. This was the one that would tell the story. At that distance, every variable was amplified. The wind, the mirage off the cold ground, the shooter's fatigue. The margin was smaller than any of them liked to discuss openly. She found the target through the scope. A 12-inch steel plate, sitting in the early morning gray at just over 1,100 yards. The wind was moving. She tracked it. It was inconsistent, cycling between 12 and 17 knots, with irregular pauses. She needed a pause. She waited for it. 15 seconds into the 30-second window. The wind dropped. She fired. The silence after the shot was about 2 seconds. The time it takes for a bullet to travel 1,100 yards. The time it takes for sound to return to you. The time it takes for the world to confirm what you've done. Then the plate rang. A clean, high note that carried across the range in the cold air, unmistakable. She did not move. She remained in position, as she always did, counting her breath until the counting became unnecessary. After the exercise, during the debrief, the range officer read the results. 3 for 3 on the final mile course. She was the only shooter on the team with a clean card. Quinlan had gone 2 for 3. Estes had gone 2 for 3. Darrow had hit 1. Breck with the cough had been pulled before the final mile on a medic's call. The room was quiet when the range officer finished reading. Quinlan looked at his scorecard. He had the expression of a man doing a particular kind of math. Not the kind that involved numbers, but the kind that involved recalculating what he'd assumed to be true. He nodded once, slowly, at his own scorecard. It was not directed at anyone. It was internal. Estes looked at the ceiling, then he looked at her. Wind at 1,100, he said. How long did you wait? 15 seconds, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I would have taken the shot at 10. He paused. I would have missed at 10. Probably, she said without judgment, because it was probably true, and he'd said it as information, not self-criticism. Darrow said nothing. He was studying his own scorecard in the focused way of a man who had decided something but hadn't finished deciding it. Later, not in the debrief, but 3 days later, at the start of a range session, he came up beside her and said, without preamble, you want to show me what you're doing with your breathing? On the extended hold. And she did, and that was the end of that particular silence between them. What Hartley had meant to accomplish, and what he had actually accomplished, were, in the end, two different things. He had meant to introduce doubt. He had instead created a record, a re-qualification under scrutiny, observed and logged and formally documented, that was not just as good as the original. It was better because it was witnessed, because it was structured, because it had been designed by someone who didn't believe the results and had therefore made the conditions harder than usual. She had met those conditions. He had been at the debrief of the final mile. She had not known he would be there until she walked in. He was seated at the back of the room, in civilian clothes, which meant this was unofficial. Personal curiosity, perhaps, or professional obligation, or both. When the range officer read her results, she did not look at Hartley. She didn't need to. But afterward, as people filed out of the room, he was standing near the door. She walked past him. He said one thing, "Your father taught you well." She paused. She looked at him. He was not smiling, and there was no warmth in it, and she understood that this was not an apology and probably never would be. It was the closest he knew how to get. In a different register, from a different man, it might have meant very little. From Hartley, it was something. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," she said. He did. She walked out into the morning. The sun was up now, bright and direct off the eastern tree line. She could feel the warmth of it on the back of her neck as she crossed the gravel to the road. Somewhere behind her, she heard the door swing shut on its spring. She had a training session at 1300. She needed to eat. She needed 2 hours of sleep if she could get them, which she probably could. She thought about these things in the practical, forward-moving way. She thought about everything that needed doing. The morning was cold and getting warmer. She walked into it.